Hi, everyone, and very welcome to this live stream that we are doing in memory of UPS flight 2976 and the horrible accident that happened in Louisville, Kentucky it's last day now. So today is the 5th, and this accident happened on the 4th. Together with me today, I have Ben from Airline Pilot Performance. Ben, great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Good evening, everybody.
So this is a dark day. We've lost 3 colleagues, and there's very few words that can explain how that feels for people that are working in the industry. And I just want people to remember that when we start this live stream, because there are what we are going to try to do with this, right? The reason that we're doing this live stream and the reason that we've done similar live streams when other tragedies have happened is because we know that there's a lot of people out there who are afraid. They see those horrible images that are being cabled out on social media, and they have questions about how something like this can happen and what we pilots do in these kind of circumstances. And there will also inevitably be a lot of misinformation that's going to be flooding the zone. So we try to do these live streams to talk about things that we can talk about. We do not speculate on the cause, because it is going to take a long while before we know what actually caused this horrible accident. So if you're here to hear us speculate about the cause, that's not what we're going to do. Instead, we are going to be talking about what we do know, the official information that is out there. And then we're going to be talking about things like how we calculate our takeoff performance, how we deal with engine failures after takeoff. And I'm also really happy to announce that together with us today, we have Captain Shem Malmqvist, which is a senior line training captain on the MD-11 and an accident investigator and also a professor. And he will be joining us later on in the stream, talking specifically about handling characteristics of the MD-11, which was the aircraft that was involved in this accident. So, and he's also going to be talking about what, accident investigators will look at, how they will go through when an accident like this happened. So he's going to come on in a while, but before we get there, I just want to give you a little bit about what we know so far. So the aircraft that you can see on the picture is a representation of the accident aircraft. It's a 34-year-old MD-11 that started its life in Thai Airways as a passenger aircraft, and it worked for a couple of years there before in 2006 it was converted into a freighter and started being used in the UPS fleet. We have been looking into the history of this aircraft, and it doesn't seem like it had any previous incidents or accidents. There are unverified reports out there that this aircraft was undergoing service and that it was delayed for its departure with a few hours because some kind of maintenance was being done to it. However, we do not know if that is true or not. So these are the kind of facts that we have to wait for the investigators to give us, right? So when you hear something on X or wherever you're getting your news, just know that anyone who says that they know what happened, they just don't yet. Neither do we. But what we do know is that the aircraft eventually, we don't know with how much delay, started moving out from its parking position, fully loaded with cargo for its flight from Louisville in Kentucky, United States, over towards Honolulu in Hawaii. Sources are saying that it was loaded with about 220,000 pounds of fuel. That's about 100 tons. And just to get a little bit of perspective into that, 100 tons of fuel, that's more than the weight of a fully loaded 737, right? Just in fuel. So there was a lot of fuel on board this flight. But on board the flight, we know that there were 3 crew members, and they started taxiing out towards runway 17 right, which was in use for departure at the time. And so far, we don't have any information about cockpit voice recorder, flight data recorder, of course, because it only happened yesterday. The first information we're going to get from that is probably going to come in the interim report, which is likely going to be published in about 3 months or so. But anyway, the aircraft lined up on runway 17 right, and it initiated the takeoff roll at time 22:12 UTC. That's 17:12 local times. This was in the late afternoon. And after that, we don't have much information. We haven't seen the beginning of the takeoff roll. The only thing that we have so far is these horrible video clips taken from different sources showing the aircraft accelerating down the runway. And I'm sure that you've all seen variations of this clip already, and you're probably going to see it from many more angles as more people start to upload their dash cams and their mobile phone videos and whatever. But the video that we have, you can see here, there's a lot of smoke that was trailing the aircraft, something that looks like fire coming off the left-hand side of the aircraft. And we can also see here that the aircraft actually did get airborne. According to flight radar 24, they managed to get up to a speed of about 186 knots and an altitude of maybe 150 feet or so before it started losing altitude. And then its landing gear and probably also part of its body impacted a shipping facility, a UPS shipping facility that was just on the far end outside of the airport perimeter from Louisville Airport. And after it impacted that, it kind of started shifting over and cartwheeled into some more buildings and then out on over a parking lot and burst into this enormous fireball that we can see, which makes perfect sense. It's 220,000 pounds of fuel on board. But this is kind of what we know. We know so far that there's been 9 people killed, so that's 3 people on board the aircraft and 6 people on the ground, and there's 11 injuries so far, but those figures are probably going to rise as we get more and more information. So when something like this happens, there's always going to be rolling information, and things are very, very fluent right now. So, with having said that, this is what we know so far, right? We don't. There are also, I should mention, that there are some pictures that I've seen on various forums that shows parts of one engine, including the engine cowling and what looks like the core of the engine of the MD-11. And we have been able to kind of geolocate this using Google Earth to somewhere around the poppies on the far end of runway 179. So if that's the case, these pieces are laying at the end of the runway. And the reason I'm saying that we are not sure is because we haven't gotten these pictures officially verified. And in today's AI world, you can never really trust any kind of pictures until they have been verified by an official source. But if that is the case, it means that one of the engines, presumably the number 1 engine on the left-hand side, departed the aircraft inside of the airport perimeter before the crash happened. So this is kind of what we know so far. It's a horrific tragedy, and my thoughts goes to all, the families of the deceased, the flight crew, and the people on the ground, as well as the injured on the ground, of course. And I just want to make it absolutely clear that the reason that we're doing this now is to give as much information to you guys and to answer your questions as well. So towards the end of this, we're going to take questions from the chat. This is going out on all 3 of our channels simultaneously to reach as many people as possible. And I really urge you to keep your questions respectful and remember the kind of the sober situation that we're all in. Ben, I think that the way that we will start this is, there's bound to be questions. For example, this aircraft, why did it continue the takeoff? Why didn't it stop? Do you want to go into how we calculate our takeoff performance?
Yeah, sure. Good evening, everybody. So Petter, like me, we've been inundated with messages over the last, last day or so. And there's a lot of genuine curiosity out there with going, well, but why did this aircraft continue the takeoff? Surely if there was something that wrong, the crew should have stopped. Equally, why, if it did continue to take off, why didn't it get airborne, and so on? And there are a lot of genuine questions there. So I think what we can do, Petter, is at least shine a light on what goes on behind the scenes here when we're doing our takeoff performance and what happens when we lose an engine.
Yeah.
Now, One thing to kind of point out here right from the beginning that may not be clear to everybody is that we treat every single takeoff as unique. And before we get airborne, well, we're on the stand before we push back and start engines. For every single takeoff that we do, we perform a very specific takeoff calculation. And what that does is it takes the specific aircraft that we're departing in, the runway we're using, the weather conditions, temperatures, the runway length, condition of the runway, etc. We pump all of that into a computer and it will give us very accurate, very specific performance data that we use. And this is based on the fact or the assumption that an engine is going to fail at the most critical point, the worst point that it could fail. So that we know that when we depart, we can depart safely. Now, what does that mean? Well, it kind of hinges around a point called V1. A lot of you will know of and have heard about V1. And one myth I kind of want to get kind of dispel here as such is that V1 itself is a decision speed. Yes and no. V1 is an airspeed that by which actions need to be taken. So by its very nature, the decision needs to have been made before V1. So V1 is a point by which either it's the highest airspeed by which we first have to have made the first action to reject a takeoff. So if something's gone wrong before V1, we have to have begun the rejected takeoff before V1. So let's say this incident occurred, they got a big bang, strange engine noises, vibrations. The crew could have safely rejected the takeoff and stopped within the runway. Once we get to V1, we're now committed to get airborne. No matter what the problem is, and there's a period of time between V1 and rotate where you're kind of in this not no man's land, but you can see the runway end approaching you, but you know no matter what problems you get, we are now committed to getting airborne. And you might ask, well, why? Why can't you just stop, particularly on a very long runway? Well, this might not just be the runway length that is limiting here. We have things such as maximum brake energy that the wheels can absorb. And if we go beyond that, we're too fast, too heavy, when the brakes will fade, we're not going to be able to stop at the end of the runway. So V1 is the maximum speed at which we can begin the rejected takeoff. It's also the minimum speed at which we can continue the takeoff safely if an engine now fails and safely reach at what we call a screen height, which is a minimum height above the other end of the runway, which typically is 35 feet, and then continue a climb, clearing all of the obstacles. But the elephant in the room here is why, if the crew continued to take off, did it not get airborne and continue to climb?
Yeah.
From what you can see, Peter, would you say it's safe to assume that this occurred after V1?
I mean, again, the only reason that I would believe that would be because they did try to get it airborne, right? If any kind of severe engine malfunction happens before V1, we do automatically reject. And the reason that we can do that is because we know that we have enough runway and potential clearway to get the aircraft safely stopped, right? So the only reason that you would try to rotate and get into the air would be if that failure is noticed by the crew once they had already passed V1.
Yeah.
So that is it. But like you said, the question then becomes, if they've done these calculations, which they've had to do, well, then they have enough trust theoretically to continue the takeoff with one engine failure, even if that engine falls off, even if it departs the aircraft. The performance calculations should tell them that it should be able to safely climb, right? And obviously herein lies the mystery that the investigators are going to have to get into. Now, I have already seen, and I mentioned that in my short that I put out, a lot of people are making connections to the American Airlines Flight 191 disaster that happened, which I've covered on the Metropolitan channel, by the way. Now, what we have to understand is that after that accident, there was significant changes made to the DC-10. So this is the precursor to the MD-11. It's not the same aircraft. There were a lot of changes made to the hydraulic system, for example, the slat system, to avoid a similar thing happen. And we have to also remember that in the American Airlines Flight 191, the aircraft actually did get airborne. Like it got airborne, got up to a quite high altitude, but then because it lost hydraulic pressure, the slats retracted, it lost lift on the left-hand side, and it turned over and fell down. So that's a very different thing from what we're seeing here. Here we're seeing an aircraft that is rotated, and we can actually see, I don't know if we have the video here, we can see that the the attitude that they maintain after rotation is actually quite high. This is from a parking lot nearby. You can see that the attitude of the nose is very high. The aircraft just will not climb. It just continues down. So this is something else, and we just gonna have to wait to see what the technical investigators comes up with to explain why this happened. Yeah, did you want to add?
Just as a point to note is that the initial reports, or from what we're hearing, it sounds as though the engine did separate. It may not be true, but from what we're seeing, it did separate, which is why we're seeing the fire over the wing. But a point to note there is if the engine did separate, there's potentially less drag, because rather than having an engine that's just hanging under the wing now, catching all of the air, creating drag, the engine is gone. So the fact that the engine is gone, although being more dramatic to look at, and yes, there's a fire, which is a separate topic, aerodynamically, it should have less drag. Fire will play a role in creating that drag, but that's something to bear in mind as well. So if we kind of take this a bit further now, and we talk about how we handle the jet once it gets airborne, because the MD-11 is a bit unique. It'd be great to talk to Shem about this in a moment, because it has 3 engines, whereas Petra and I coming from a background of flying Boeings with 2 engines. But there's obviously a large thrust asymmetry, which means obviously one engine is producing thrust, the other isn't. That has a yawing tendency, and we have to counter that. And we do that primarily with the rudder. So as the crew, from their perspective, they're not going to see that fire that we see. They would have seen and felt bangs, vibrations, strange engine instrument indications. After V1, they would have correctly made the decision to keep going. To prevent the aircraft yawing off, they would have applied opposite rudder. So they would have applied with their feet rudder to keep the aircraft on the center line, and then rotated the aircraft by pulling back on the control column to a set pitch attitude to get the aircraft climbing away at their rotation speed. And then once you're airborne, that rudder will be maintained. In the Boeing 737, we do it manually. It'd be interesting to hear from Shem whether there is an auto rudder function on the MD-11. But either way, the rudder will be applied to keep us climbing away and maintain directional control of the aircraft, which our performance calculations should ensure happens. We have enough rudder authority and airspeed to achieve that.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note as well, and you can actually see it on flight data, or sort of from flight radar 24 pictures. You can see that the aircraft did start, even when it was over the runway, you can see it starting to move a little bit over to the left, which is consistent with having asymmetric thrust, with thrust being coming from the right hand side, but not from the left hand side. But it's really straight, like there's no huge go over to the left. So this is something that when we're doing engine failures at V1, which we practice in the simulator all the time, as instructors, when we're looking at the our instructor screens, this almost always happens. If they have a V1 cut, as we call them, you'll see a small deviation towards the dead engine, and you can see that on the flight radar 24 tracks as well, and you can actually see it going a little bit to the left. I see a lot of people in the comments talking about potential problems with the other engines. Again, we don't know that, so it's impossible for us to discuss it. But one thing that we can say is that, of course, there's always a risk if we're talking about a separation, an engine separation in one shape or form, that when it separates, that it impacts other parts of the aircraft. So I would guess that the investigators are probably going to have to look closely into that. But again, we're going to talk to Shem about how the investigators will look at something like this from in just a few seconds.
Yeah, so without further ado, shall we bring Shem on, and we can go through some more MD-11 specifics?
Yeah, absolutely. Shem, great to have you here. Yeah, there's always something.
It's fighting with me.
There we go.
All right.
Cool.
Realigned here with the camera.
Yeah. So before we start, so Shem, you are a line check captain on the MD-11.
I was. I'm actually recently retired, and then I left the MD-11 in 2016. But I was involved with the aircraft and the program fairly closely for a number of years, having been involved with several of the major accidents and led several of the accidents that we had on behalf of the union, and then as well as for the company on a few others. So I've been immersed on pretty much every aspect of the airplane, from handling qualities to specific design. And I worked with Douglas very closely over those years.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. It's in a situation like this, it's always best to talk to the people who actually flown the aircraft and has been so technically immersed as you have been. It's a great honor to have you on the channel. So thank you for doing this.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So one question that I would have would be, you've done a couple of LPCs on this aircraft. How does it handle if you get a V1 cut and then you failure on takeoff?
It's really not bad on takeoff. As mentioned, it does have a feature called parallel rudder, which provides some support for the rudder initially until the roll mode is changed. So on a direct takeoff, that's going to be somewhat offset. The airplane is fairly easy to handle. I always thought in terms of that. The one thing that is different from the twins that, of course, you both were flying is that the amount of thrust when you lose an engine, you still have the same criteria, but you have with three engines. So if you have an engine inoperative, the requirement in terms of screen heights that you need to clear are the same, but you're doing that with 2/3 thrust rather than just half the thrust. And that does change the amount of thrust available and changes the dynamic a bit. But even without the parallel rudder, it's not difficult to maintain control as long as you're over your VMCA, just like any other aircraft.
Yeah. And because obviously looking at the MD-11, the rudder is obviously relatively small compared to the tail, having that large engine on the rear of the aircraft. Did that have any? I mean, you said that it handles fairly benign. Obviously, that had no impact on the handling of the aircraft.
Yeah, I've never noticed any effect. Although it's fairly small, it has a lot of authority.
Okay.
And so just in general, I have never noticed any particular issues in terms of trying to maintain directional control during takeoff. As long as, of course, you had your airspeed, in the V2 region. If you start getting slow, just like any airplane, it starts creating problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously we don't know any airspeed data so far. The flight radar 24 is mentioning 186 knots of ground speed, and we don't know what the winds are. But what was a typical rotation speed on this thing when it's fully loaded?
In this case, it's going to be pretty heavy. So you're looking at something over. I'm just trying to go by memory. It's been a while. I remember the approach speed and that max landing weight is 167 knots.
Okay.
So you're looking at pretty high speeds, and I don't have a number on top of my head because I've been flew the 777 most recently, which has a different set of numbers, of course. But it's high. It's on the higher end of approaching 200 knots, but does not exceed 204 because that is your tire limitation speed. So it's up there around a 180-ish for sure, depending on what's going on.
And obviously, we've spoken about the possibility of an engine being separated from the aircraft itself. In the 737, we have a checklist for an engine separation. It wouldn't have helped this crew either way because they never got to a point where they could have actioned that checklist. But does the MD-11 have a similar checklist?
There is only a fire and severe damage checklist on any of the QRH or quick reference handbooks that I have seen. And it would assume that would be part of those procedures. But the only memory item for that anyway is just throttle to idle. We don't do anything else anyway. So it's not going to accomplish a whole lot at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's maybe worth mentioning then, like the memory items that we have on the 737 when we get an engine failure or any fire, severe damage, a separation, which is what our checklist is called. And it's similar. I mean, what was the memory item you said, Shem, that you had on the MD-11?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear that.
Yeah, so the only memory item that you had on the MD-11 in case of an engine failure or any severe damage.
Yeah, just throttle idle.
just to
Okay.
try to.
And even that is not done, at least the way we were always trained. We didn't do that right away anyway.
No.
Immediately on takeoff, you'd get up, get to a safe speed, and then you would start doing those kinds of things. So you wouldn't be moving things around at 100 feet.
No.
No, and that's worth mentioning here as well, that we like in the 737 as well, we don't do anything until we are safely established above 400 feet and with the aircraft fully under control. That's kind of the way that we do it. So in this case, these guys, they never reached that high, so they would have been in the initial part of the rotation stage, basically, as this happened. Ben, I'm just going to mention that if you could mute your mic when you're not talking, because we're getting some feedback and people are complaining in the chat. There we go. So another question then, which is maybe more interesting here. If we're not going into discussing what caused this, we only know what's happened. You are an investigator. So if you were an investigator in this case, how would you, when the NTSB people are coming in to look into this now, what kind of strategy would they have? What would they be looking at?
Well, the NTSB's methods are a bit different than what I've been teaching here at the Florida Tech. Methods that were developed out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's program, which are causal analysis using system theory, which allows for a lot more comprehensive analysis than is normally put in place on any of these accidents. Although there are some investigating agencies that are starting to apply it, it's taking a bit of time. It's fairly new. But when we first get there, the first thing, of course, is identifying all the components of the aircraft. We're going to be collecting any type of video that we can get. A lot of that is just to collaborate what we can get out of the flight data recorders. But in addition, sometimes you can see things on a video that you just can't get out of the data mapping. For example, actual control positions that might indicate something. And although most of those are mapped, not all of them are. And sometimes they can detect something that it just didn't pick up. And so they are very interesting to compare. And of course, the voice recorder, all of that is going to be normal. They will go up there and confirm exactly where things happen, so you can correlate how the aircraft performed with or in relation to what performance data we have, and you can sort out what is going on at each stage. The next very important part is we start looking at the physical components, and one of the big items for any accident is checking to see if there were any failures, which of course we've seen that there definitely were some here. Exactly what they were haven't been identified yet. And any unsafe interactions. In other words, could that physical component have interacted with other components or other parts of the system in ways that created problems? And that would be something that would be of certain interest in this type of case. And then above that, we look at what was controlling the aircraft. That could be software or human. And we analyze what controls that were available, and then how those controls could have been moved in a way that would have created something unsafe to happen in consideration with the other interactions. And from there, we also do the same exact thing, looking at things like maintenance, the aircraft design itself, the manufacturer, the company culture, all of those things that could play into it. So we look at the entire socio-technical system. The initial field work will probably take about a week to collect everything. It's very, very long hours. I tend to get out there. And of course, with the airport, you're looking at areas that are on the airport. While you're doing that, you really have the runway not usable during that period of time. So they're going to be under some pressure to collect what they can as quickly as possible. And the same thing with the other areas of forensic collecting forensic evidence of the actual accident itself. And during that period, just like you see on a crime scene, the whole area has to be cordoned off, and preventing access to people, and also making sure no components get stolen, which has unfortunately been a problem on quite a few accidents. something goes missing, and that might be a vital component that is going to tell the tale. The initial thing that's going to happen already is the major investigation team from Washington, D.C. They'll have assembled a investigator in charge or assigned an investigator in charge. They're going to pull together team members that they believe will be pertinent for the particular accident. And those people will fly from Washington, D.C. to Louisville, in this case. They will then conduct what's called an organizational meeting that will involve different other groups that may be of interest. The FAA is automatically a party to these investigations, but UPS Corporation will certainly be a party. The Independent Pilots Association, that has, I have to say, one of the best groups that I've ever worked with. They will be involved with the investigation from the Pilots Association side and looking at particularly crew actions, the operational behavior, things of that nature. From the company, I'm sure they'll have the maintenance. They will have their union that represents the maintenance workers. I'm sure will be involved, or most likely will be involved. You would have somebody from Boeing, since Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas, so they are over those investigations. So Boeing will most certainly be part of this as well. And those are probably the major ones. You might have somebody from the airport, people of that nature, depending on what they have, or air traffic control. But if those weren't really considered factors, they might not be involved. The same with meteorology on this type of thing. So they'll assign that initial organizational group, and then they'll get to work, collecting evidence. And the operational group will right away get a stack of papers showing the history of the crew and all of their training, and they'll be looking into those aspects right away. But also, as quickly as possible, they'll be getting the cockpit voice recorder, and they'll be sending that to back to Washington, D.C., where they'll have a group, the CVR group, and they will analyze that and determine everything that was said. And then the work comes in and correlating that with what's called the performance group that looks at the aircraft performance itself. They're the ones that look at the flight data recorder, and they also will do actual aerodynamic analysis to figure out not just aerodynamic analysis. Actually, they can even look at how components were moved and what direction they should move based on the energy, the witness marks on the ground. So you can figure out at what speed something was moving at, what other effects it could have had. So we'll be looking at every single part of it. And I know most of that happens fairly quickly. The NTSB is, really does some amazing work, and they really work very hard. And, from then on, it becomes a laboratory, and they start getting together and having meetings with these different subgroups, and hopefully have an interim report, as you mentioned earlier, in just the next few months.
Yeah. I think it's really important for people to understand that. For example, I see now, that's why I'm looking at the sides here, that there's a lot of messages coming in, and everyone has their own little theory about maybe one engine failed, another engine failed, something got ingested, things like that. But from an investigator point of view, you basically just start with, did the aircraft do what it was supposed to do performance-wise? And you can like you said, correlate that with it should have taken off at this point. Did it take off at this point? And see that. And from what you can gather, the evidence-based, basically, then you can start working backwards. So instead of going what we normal people do, you see something and then you react to that and you build a theory based on what you see. You guys build it on factual evidence. The aircraft rotated where it's supposed to do. We have evidence marks on the runway that indicates the following. Is that correlated with what we see on the flight data recorder? And this is why I am so fascinated with the accident investigations, because using that procedure, you can get down to these enormously detailed, correct answers of why something like this happened, which is absolutely fundamental for us as an industry to actually learn from it and get better and find better technical solutions. So you guys do a fantastic job, and I'm super impressed with it.
It's absolutely critical. And the other part, of course, is not falling in love with your own theory. I was just talking to students today, for example, about having an incorrect airspeed and correlating that with the rate of descent that you have on final approach if you're on a glide slope. Something that's completely independent that can collaborate what or corroborate what you are seeing, and that the data is really matching up. So you don't assume that anything is correct on initial look. We always try to find as many other data points as we can that have to match up. And if something doesn't match up, you really have to take a hard look. It's very easy, even on a professional investigation team, to start out with assumptions and then try to find data to support that assumption. And at some point, generally, it comes out that, hey, this is not matching this other little piece of evidence. This piece of metal is not bent the way it needs to be to support that. We need to go back in and recalculate what might have happened here. And I mean, I've seen that firsthand on more than one investigation, actually. So it's something that absolutely can happen. There is a certain amount of momentum that it can occur. And the NTSB is, of course, very good at preventing that momentum from coming into place to prevent other findings that are really critical.
Ben, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. It may need Shem to mute, otherwise we get the big echo. But my question is, obviously it's a cargo aircraft. There's a good chance there's going to be dangerous goods on that aircraft. And dangerous goods, when they're burnt and so on, can be obviously extremely hazardous. What impact would that have, and how would the investigation be affected should there be dangerous goods on board?
It's a very good question. Absolutely. We will often have dangerous goods on board the aircraft, on cargo aircraft, and they can create all sorts of hazards. The first thing, of course, they can create problems for the crash and fire and rescue crews that get out there. And so they really need to have that information when they're going out there to know what they're getting into. Depending on what you have, that can lead to a lot of secondary risks for them. And they're really the first responders out there. When we get out there, we just have to be really careful on what we're touching. Crash scenes are really a dangerous, they're just dangerous. There's no other good way to put it. The materials are really, really toxic. You're looking at potential fumes, or even touching something that seems innocuous, like a piece of a flight control that has fiberglass, and all of a sudden you've got these little tiny slivers of fiberglass in your fingers that are like cactus needles. But there's also really poisonous stuff, things that people don't really think about. When you did another really great set of videos on the fumes that can come in off of the engine oil. And so you have all of that sort of thing going on. And especially early on, when it's still smoldering, this stuff is vaporized. But even if it's not, just in powder form, if it gets kicked up and gets on you, it can create a problem. So, what we generally would be doing is wearing hazardous material suits when we're going through the wreckage. And those themselves are awful to wear for very long. They're hot, they're miserable, but there's no other way to deal with that. And of course, very sadly here, we lost several people on the ground as well as in the aircraft. And so then you have biohazard risks as well. And all of these are part of the investigation for those people that are looking through the wreckage themselves, which isn't everybody, of course. The people that are doing like the voice recorder will just be back in the laboratory working on that. But the people that are looking at the structural components and systems and collecting that evidence for the performance are out there walking through it. And there is absolutely some risk for that you just have to be really careful about.
Yeah, I think initially they cornered off like 5 miles around the crash zone, but later media reports have indicated that there wasn't any specific dangerous goods involved in this flight, which is of course a good thing. Now, one thing that I actually saw in the chat here, which interests me, is obviously we're in the middle of a government shutdown in the United States. So, are the NTSB people actually getting paid as they do this job? Do we know that?
I know they're not. I can say that. I know they're
See
not,
I
but they're
mean
still on duty. I mean, but
yeah,
absolutely, that is something that is going on. And of course, getting people into location, all the various groups are going to have, team members that may be spread out, like the Independent Pilots Association may have their, people that they want to lead the investigator or be an investigation or be part of it, be on a trip. And, they have to get back and have to fly back. And so they could get stuck in some of these, delays at some of these airports due to, some of the air traffic issues that we have seen in the news. So all of that plays into it.
yeah,
And of course, the FAA people are also in the same boat, because the FAA will be sending their team members. They have a accident investigation group out of Washington, D.C. Really, really sharp people, by the way. They're just, once again, looking to solve the accident. They're not on the enforcement side, if you will, and they are really a huge help. But all of those people coming out will be, unfortunately, right now, not getting paid.
yeah. No, I just wanted to say that because I think people out there need to understand the enormous workload that these people are under, and at the moment they're doing that without getting paid. They are going to get back pay, but at the moment they're not getting paychecks, but they're still doing this job for the well-being of everyone around, really. So I mean,
Absolutely.
it's a truly heroic effort that we're seeing played out right now. What else? I mean, we're not going, like we said, we're not going to speculate. And I saw in the chat here as well that people said, well, it could be a good idea to work from a theory as well. Is it a good idea to work from a theory if you have one?
I would say that it's best to try to not have a theory, and collect the evidence initially. Now, we can't help as humans to speculate, and the what we call the go team, the people that are actually in the field. I mean, you're working, as I said, very long hours. And my experience is generally, 18-hour days and 6 hours of sleep, trying to get things as collected as quickly as possible. And that in itself creates all sorts of the same issues that anybody else has with lack of sleep and fatigue. And, your mind starts trying to make shortcuts. So this is one of the reasons it's really important to not try to get stuck or, really married to a theory early on, especially with the people out there as part of the Go team. The But what happens is people spend all day, and then eventually they all get together. All the different groups are, even though they're separate and they might have their separate meetings, a lot of interaction between all of the members of all the different uh, parties that are part of these investigations. And people will talk about, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? That is normal. I mean, that's literally, I mean, I think if you didn't do that as humans, we would probably go crazy. It's already traumatic enough to be walking through wreckage, especially hard, and having done it, walking through wreckage where, you lost people that you knew. And it takes an emotional toll. And when you add in that lack of sleep, your emotions just come right out, on bubbling out. Really, really hard to contain that. And so the conversations that people are having are, somewhat cathartic. It's almost the only way that you can get by. So yes, they are going to be talking about different things that they find fairly early on, but until we have that, the data recorder readouts, it gets we try not to get too far into it, and really try to limit that to the extent possible. Uh, Obviously, if you're working an accident that does not have that kind of equipment, that changes that dynamic quite a bit. But even so, we really just try to stick to the data and let it lead us in the direction that we need to go.
Yeah, and like you said, it's completely human to speculate on a personal level, and like I would be lying to say that I didn't do that together with my team when things happened as well. But I think it's really important to get out to people, especially now in the age that we live in, when someone can create an AI video of something so easily, and kind of to underpin their own theory and show things that we work with facts, and accident investigators works with facts. And if there's no facts underpinning the theory that you might have, well, then that theory is not valid. It's as easy as that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is going to be a really it'll take a while, and the investigators will get back, and then they have to decompress before they can do a whole lot more. But people are going to be really anxious to see if there's any factors that could be involved that we need to take a look at right away to prevent another accident. And so that's really the first priority is, any kind of more obvious things. Can we solve something right now? And, without waiting, that needs to get out there to, Boeing, and gets out there to the other operators of the aircraft type, or just in general to the pilot community, because this might not have involved anything specific to the airplane per se. Could be something that could potentially happen to any airplane. We see that quite a bit. Yeah, these are really important aspects that need to be looked at, and we need to find a way to try to prevent another accident as quickly as possible. And that's really the whole goal.
Yeah, but we saw that. We saw that with the recent Iberia incident, where there was an Airbus A321XLR that took off and hit a bird, hit the radome, hit the engine, filled the cabin with smoke. And the interim report came out a couple of months after, and they immediately went in and said, listen, the crew, we don't know exactly what happened here yet, but we know that the crew used their portable breathing equipment and it didn't work as designed. So immediately look at this. And it's a great example of what you just said, that the investigators will try to make aviation safer as quickly as possible. It will eventually come through the final report, obviously, but even the interim report will try to do something to make things safer. Ben, did you want to add something?
Yeah, again, Shem may have to mute there just to stop any kind of background noise. No, I mean, I think we've pretty much covered everything there. I mean, the only thing, talking about smoke in the flight deck, I don't know, obviously, the schematics of the MD-11, but obviously left engine in the 7.3 indicates potential fumes in the flight deck for us, based on the air conditioning schematic. Are there any peculiarities with the MD-11 that if there's a problem with the left engine that could affect the flight crew from an air conditioning perspective or incapacitation perspective?
I'm just trying to think that I'd have to go back and look at it to give a probably accurate answer. It seems to me that the system, the MD-11 has automatic controllers, and when something goes wrong, it automatically reroutes things as necessary in terms of the pneumatic system in order to solve that kind of thing. And so, the complete loss on the one side is it's still going to be trying to suck fumes in. I think that the system auto controller would reroute things, and so that wouldn't be the case. But I'd have to again go back and look at it again. I can't say for sure.
For as long as I've done this channel, there's been questions about why are there not cameras installed? Why don't we have cameras installed that shows what's going on in our cargo base? Why doesn't it show the landing gear, the engines? I have actually asked that question to EASA a number of years ago now, because it was part of findings in several investigations where they said it would have been helpful if we actually had some type of visual device that could record things. What's your view on that? Do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I think my opinion might not be popular with some of the pilots, but I'll relate an anecdotal experience which shaped my view of this. One of the things that I started doing, which isn't a listed procedure, was I always started looking behind the rudder pedals during my pre-flight. And on the MD-11, actually, it's facilitated because you can turn on a light that turns on for that area. But on other types, like the 777, it's just black back there. You need to get a flashlight to take a look. And one day I was doing this, and I found a large one of these, several liter bottles of, I don't know whether it was Pepsi or something, that was lodged behind the rudder pedals completely full. And I don't know how long it had been there. It was slightly bent, but it was stuck back there. And I could just imagine a scenario where the pilot was trying to take off. They went and pushed on the pedal and it would not respond. The airplane goes off the side, maybe falls up in some way. And during that time, the bottle gets dislodged and it's gone. Now, when we come out and investigate it, one of the things we do is a control continuity check, and everything is working. And so the pilot's saying, well, I tried to push it and it didn't happen, but we have no evidence to support that at all. And guess what? That's going to end up being pilot error. So I don't know that I wouldn't say that we should have eye tracking or put anything on the pilot's faces. But if there's a way, and there is now with current technology, to just show the surfaces themselves. So we know maybe that pilot did try to turn on that engine anti-ice. They pushed the button and it just didn't take, which happens. This is what buttons do, or whatever the control was. And so now we know that, the pilot actually did the right thing. We have a design problem that's going on. And this would be an example of the kind of thing that we could capture, that there is no sensing that will capture that kind of information. So I would advocate for something like that. It, we already separately have their voice and, any kind of sounds. So this is really just of the panels and the switches and the controls themselves. So you can see how they were actually moved. And I'm not sure what the objection would be of that, but I know that pilots are very hesitant. It was a big fight just to get voice recorders in the airplane. So, that's an ongoing fight. But that would be something I think would make a tangible difference on some of these.
I can just out of the top of my head, I did a video a few months ago about I was thinking it was an EasyJet flight that lost their both electrical sources. So they basically got completely black. And the captain went in and he said, I followed the procedure. I tried to reset the system according to the QRH. I pressed it, 1 time, 2 times. It didn't take. And like you said, a video recording of that would have shown that. They could never, like the final report could never conclusively say whether or not it worked, if it was a button failure, if he actually did it, if it misremembered it. So you're absolutely right, and I agree. The ones that are against specifically cameras in the cockpit are unions. They tend to be for different reasons, which I covered in another video. A lot of videos, but external video cameras, like me personally, I would like to have cameras in the cargo hold. You have an engine fire, sort of cargo fire indication. You wouldn't know that if it's faulty or not, because it makes a huge difference to the way that you decision make, basically. But the same thing, landing gears, is it down or not? It would be handy to see.
Yeah, or of the flight controls, being able to get a better view, of looking at a wing on a cargo aircraft. Of course, you have no way to do that at all. On a passenger airplane, you can send somebody back to look at it. But even so, if we can have some, cameras of these different types of components, and of course you do see that, riding on a lot of the airlines, if you're in business class, or whatever class, I guess, you can pull up a camera, looking forward over the aircraft or things like that. I know I've seen that on the A350s or the A380s, which do provide a pretty nice view of the overall configuration of the aircraft, and that could be very useful. So this could definitely be done, and cameras are small enough and light enough that you could really create something extremely helpful in this regard.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of, I think, customers requesting it or demanding it.
Yeah, and I think in Qantas 32, the Airbus A380 that got an uncontained engine failure, then the pilots actually went back and looked at the seat rests of one of the passengers to get an overview of the aircraft. So they actually utilized that, but they didn't have access to it in the cockpit. Anyway, yes. There was a good question here as well that I wanted to bring up. So someone asked, what's the difference between an engine, like handling-wise, between an engine separation and an engine fire? And it is actually quite interesting because with an engine fire only, Like if there's an engine fire, there can be a fire in many different places inside of an engine. But when we simulate that, you have the option to either have it with or without thrust, because essentially you could have an engine fire and still have engine thrust going, which means that now you have an issue, then, but you're not getting the asymmetric thrust that you would get with a failure. And that makes it easier to take off, but harder once you actually start doing your memory items and shutting it down, because now all of a sudden you introduce that yaw, you introduce that asymmetric thrust. So an engine fire is a bit tricky because there's really no way of telling how it will affect the engine thrust or when it will affect the engine thrust. We only know that it's not good with the fire and you need to get it out. On the other hand, Ben, what happens if you get an engine separation on the 737?
Yeah, so sure. If you get an engine separation in the 7.3, I mean, obviously you're going to get the asymmetry very, very rapidly, unlike just a fire on its own. But you're going to lose all of your engine instrumentation as well. So normally, if you have a fire or a failure or a severe damage, you can look at your engine instrumentation, and we train pilots to diagnose the type of failure that they're looking at based on the way the engine is presenting itself. So with the severe damage, you might say hit a bird, you lose a fan blade, you're looking for the engine to have some form of abnormal indication. You're still probably going to have a lot of thrust, but it's going to be abnormal. But you're also going to have airframe vibration. You're going to feel the vibration through the aircraft, but you're probably still going to have fairly symmetrical thrust. Again, that has its challenges. But if you lost an engine literally separated from the airframe, all of the sensors are gone. So your engine parameters on your display now are just going to be completely gone. They're just blank. That's how we would diagnose a separation itself. But again, from a handling perspective, I would imagine we don't really simulate a separation in the sim, do we? But like I said before, we're losing a whole engine, which otherwise would be causing a lot of drag against an engine that's producing a lot of thrust on the other engine. You remove that bit of drag, the aircraft should be easier to control from that perspective. But yeah, diagnosing the engine fault, we typically do that above 400 feet. This crew never got to that point. So they probably were not thinking about this. They were just purely aiming at flying the aircraft.
Yeah. Another great question that came up. I just saw it come through here. So one of the viewers is saying this aircraft was in for maintenance before. Again, we don't know that yet. That has been implied, but we don't know that. That aircraft should have never taken off because it was in maintenance before. Now, I just want to explain to you how we pilots kind of think around that. So the whole aviation world builds on trust, right? It builds on us trusting air traffic control. We trust our engineers. The flying public, trust us pilots to do the right thing and take the right decisions. We follow, when it comes to maintenance, we follow very strict procedures. Maintenance personnel goes through checklists when they do maintenance. And when they do a D check, for example, which is a heavy maintenance check on aircraft, they go through all of these checklists and they're supposed to follow them. And when they sign off that this D check has been completed and the aircraft is released to service, we pilots will accept that. Because the opposite, if you think about it, would be mayhem. Like, at what point would we then go for a flight? What kind of maintenance would we pilots not accept? So it's like, there are, for example, and there's nuances to this. If I go in and I get a tech log and I see that there's been an issue with this aircraft, and I go back, which we do, you go back a couple of days in the tech log, and you see that the same maintenance issue has appeared again and again, and it's just been closed. We've done a byte check, it's closed, it's gone. And then the next day you see it pop up again, and they've done the same thing, and they've done the same thing. That would be a reason where I, as a captain, would say, no, actually, I want this properly checked before I accept this aircraft, right? But the aircraft coming out of maintenance, just a maintenance procedure that we do periodically throughout an aircraft's life, you would, like, if you didn't accept that, it would mean that all of the aircraft would just stop working after its first check. So this is where you defer to the flight crew, the captain's judgment, and what they're saying. I mean, would you agree with that, Shem?
No, absolutely. It's just reminds me of when I worked in flight operations management and had a pilot raise an issue, something like that. And in the end, I said, well, even if it's not working the way you think, is it safe? Could you safely fly the airplane? The answer in this case was yes. Well, is it signed off? So yes. So it's legal. So you're safe and legal. I mean, you really don't have the capability to second guess an experienced aircraft maintenance technician or engineer. Uh, it's very analogous to me to a student pilot in the back of the airplane complaining that you didn't do a run up on your 737. Their knowledge of what they think you need to do, it's just not the same. Also, just looking again, and it made me think about it a little bit more. The parallel rudder on the MD-11 is an auto flight feature. So initially on takeoff, you're just holding it, and then you can engage the autopilot above 100 feet, and then it does input that rudder, which is a very nice feature. But there's plenty of rudder to hold it anyway. But the other thing is there is an issue of feedback of what the airplane is doing. And you mentioned that, if you have the engine still running, for example, the fire situation, that you don't have feedback on what engine is actually shut down. And this is a really critical thing, is that we need to have feedback to know what to correct. We are trying to control something, and then you have feedback on what it's doing, and you need to analyze it. And I'm reminded of some of the newer airplanes, for example, the 787 that has no yaw at all. If it has an engine failure, it's just going to track straight because the system automatically absorbs it. So then you are really limited to your instruments and your indications to detect what exactly happened. Obviously, quite a bit different than this particular case, but just a data point when you're talking about the different ways that we train things. And the other part about training that I think is I don't know that would come up in any of this accident itself, but in general, the way that we are training in the simulator very often does not match how things occur in the real world. We do a lot of shortcuts. We do things in ways that will make things a little bit easier. And the real world is sometimes not so kind. So you can end up in an unexpected situation that is just outside anything that was even contemplated in training, just because they figured it was a low probability event, or they didn't have time or the bandwidth. In some cases, it even could be that they felt that was too difficult for some of the pilots and they'd have too high of a failure rate. And all of these are real concerns in terms of training. So to me, training has to be looked at really, really hard, because are we training people to manage very unusual circumstances, or is everything kind of a scripted event where things are very predictable?
Yeah. As an examiner there, I obviously I've seen both sides of this. So in my world, the training should be very, very similar to what we do in real life. So the training needs to be taken in. This is why we have the safety management systems, where you take in stuff that happens out on the line and you feed that into the training department to make sure that we do train on things that actually happen in real life. Checking is a little bit harder because it has to be the same for everyone involved, and it has to be fair in a way. So checking is a different type of animal. But what we can say without speculating is that it's very high likelihood that these poor pilots that flew on this particular aircraft had never trained what they were facing, because combination of whatever happened here, if the engine was inside of the parameter, it dropped off, right? So engine separation with potential other kinds of things happening to it. We don't know what that engine impacted when it fell off and stuff like that. It would have been an array of different problems that they would have faced immediately within seconds. And we cannot possibly create training scenarios for every conceivable combination. This is where we have to be resilient. The pilots have to be trained to handle problems in general, and then apply that knowledge onto any type of situation that they face. And sometimes it's just too much, as we saw.
Yeah, I'm reminded of years ago in the early 1980s. I one of my mentors was a retired American Airlines captain, had retired in the early 1970s off the Boeing 707, who was still an instructor for American and ended up being an instructor for many, many years. And after the American 199 or 191 accident out of Chicago, he remarked that he had gotten into the simulator and he said you could fly it, but you could not do so following the procedures that were outlined, which was continuing the climb until a safe altitude and then working the problem. He said you had to immediately lower the nose, reduce the other engine's thrust a bit to maintain control, and just fly it straight and level. And in that circumstance, he said, yeah, it was possible to do, but it's completely outside of anything that any pilots were trained and were trained after that either. Nobody ever went back and said, try this. But, something that I've long advocated, if something isn't working, you need to try something else. Of course, in this particular case, they didn't have time to do anything. But, in that American 191 case is very interesting that it is possible sometimes to fly some of these scenarios, but not necessarily while following the company procedures. And we leave it up to the pilot to make that determination. And if you make the wrong decision, of course, you're still blamed. So you're blamed for it whether you do or don't. And that's an ongoing challenge that we have.
Yeah. So I think what we'll do now, I think we've gotten to kind of the point of how much we can reach here. I want to take a few more questions from the audience. So send in your questions, please, and we will pick a few that sounds interesting and that we can answer. But I also want to make a final point here, which is super, super important. And that is, I've seen a lot of mentions about maintenance issues, a lot of mentions about someone making a mistake. Do not make the mistake of assuming anything or assigning any type of blame before the official investigation is done. Right? You can be absolutely sure that there are a lot of people are involved in this incident now that is being interviewed by the investigation team to see what went wrong. But in aviation, we are not looking for scapegoats. In aviation, we are looking to find the problem that caused whatever mistake that was made. Right. So we're not looking to find someone whose fault it was that this aircraft crashed. No, we're looking to find a procedure or something that was lacking within a system that we can do something about on a global scale to make sure that it doesn't happen again. Scapegoating is not what we do in aviation because it just does not help. The only thing that it does is it drives people on the ground. People start lying. They're not forthcoming with what they actually did because they think they are going to be punished for it. And that's not the point. No one wants an aircraft to crash, ever. With the odd exception of some terrorists, maybe. But apart from that, everyone that does go to work every single day do their absolute best to keep the industry as safe as possible. And if they fail doing that, it's because of a system that needs to be updated. It's not because of an individual mistake. So I think we remember the Überlingen mid-air collision that happened where eventually the air traffic controller was killed by a relative of the people that was on board the flight. That's what I'm talking about. Like, this is not what we want to see. We don't want to assign blame because this is what happens when people get involved and when emotions gets involved. We want to find the root cause and eliminate it. And on that, let's see if we have any questions that we want to. Or Ben, by the way, did you have anything else that you wanted to cover?
No, not really. I was just going to echo what you guys were saying. Echo might be the optimum word at the minute, but echo what you guys were saying regarding the training, because I think one of the biggest positives that have gone into training recently is evidence-based training, where we look at what's going out in the world, what crew are doing individually, and then training competencies rather than specific events. Because if you go back in not too long ago, crews would be trained in specific events, engine failures or rapid depressurizations. And we still do these, of course, but what we now do is we focus on their what we call their competencies, which is their ability to make decisions, to manage workload, to enhance their situation awareness, to build resiliency. And if you get good at that, it doesn't matter what failures you get anymore. You can deploy these skills to adapt what you do know to fit the scenario. But of course, there's always going to be scenarios that are impossible to deal. It's an impossible hand you're dealt. But I think it's a great bit of progress in aviation training that's going to certainly make aviation safer going forward.
Good. So we have a question here. Wasn't the MD-11 called the flying coffin? Kind of implying that the aircraft in itself maybe wasn't that easy or dangerous to fly even. I'll leave that one to you, Sean.
I think early on there were people that said that. It did have a number of different types of events that were due to different factors. A lot of them could be said to be training, and then some pushing, I guess you could say they pushed the envelope quite a bit on design features early on. But, at this stage, I find the airplane, I always really enjoyed flying the airplane. I didn't find it a particularly difficult aircraft to fly, although you did have to stay ahead of it. And it did require, I guess you would say, methods or techniques that would be more applicable to what I would consider a legacy jet, something from the 1960s, as opposed to some of the newer designs that are relatively more docile. But in this case, there's no indication to me, looking at this, that the airplane design itself maybe contributed, that we have, at least no information that we have so far. Let me put it that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, most of those issues that they had initially was during the landing phase, wasn't it? So the takeoff phase in itself, I don't remember having many issues on the MD-11 per se, but I might be wrong.
Correct. Yeah, there was a few landing events, and there were a few that were in cruise flight where somebody was you ended up with some aircraft oscillations and some people were injured in that regard. But the rest were really landing events that we were looking at, and they were specific factors that were going on that are really unrelated to anything we saw in this particular event.
Yeah. So American Republican is asking here, previous crew resource manager in international cargo. Does the MD-11 have an auto-fuel feed shutoff for engine fire?
And that I would say that I can't, I don't recall one, but I'd have to go back and look. I think it might, but I have to go back and look. I'd have to look back in the manual. I just don't remember right this second.
Yeah. And by the way, that is the answer of someone who's a professional, because when you don't know, you check it out. That's the way that we're supposed to do things. On the 737 that we fly, it doesn't automatically shut off the fuel. You have to do it with the fuel handle, basically. So, and I guess there could be pros and cons with having such a feature. If, for example, you have a spurious warning or something going wrong in a sensor, you don't really want to lose an engine immediately. So that's why I guess on the 737, it leaves it to the pilots to decide to actually pull on the fire handle that will close the fuel spar valve. But the MD-11 is a different beast for sure. Ben,
I'm just looking. I do not see that feature. I believe it's activated with the engine fire handle only, or the fuel switch.
Ben, did you find anything interesting?
No, the ones you're looking at there, I think there's a lot of repetitive questions that have kind of been asked, and you've covered a lot. We've just covered a lot of those there. People are asking about the CVR and the flight data recorder. Will they survive that kind of fire? And from my understanding, they will. But Shem, you're in a better position to answer that than I am.
Yeah, they definitely should. I would say. I mean, it's pretty unusual for that to not be the case. So we would have. They're really amazingly robust. The other recorder on board is a quick access recorder, and that is more questionable, but I've seen that survive pretty horrific events as well. So, and that gives you a whole lot of data that goes back even further than the flight data recorder.
Yeah. We also have a mention here from Total Malarkey, which is less of a question and more of a statement. Just got here, so I don't know if you all commented on it already, but I listened to the local fire dispatch traffic from immediately after, and they did an absolutely fantastic job considering the size and scope of the area of the fire. So yeah, it seems like the firefighters and the rescue crews that were called in, which I'm guessing was both from the airport and from the nearby firefighting stations, since it was outside of the area. But having been an airport firefighter myself, this is a terrible scenario. The only bright side, if there's any, is that it wasn't full of hundreds of people. But it would have been pretty clear very early on that there would be no survivors in this. So it's more about securing the area and protecting people around. Let's see if there's anything else that pops up. Did you see any other kind of common threads, Ben, and questions?
No, not really. I think we've covered a lot of the common questions that have been asked, and I think Shem has done a great job in kind of answering a lot of them without even having the questions being asked. So I think we've covered the majority here now.
Yeah. So we have to do something about that echo. So to finish this off, we have not a question, but something from GS2K as well. It says, "Thank you for the great guest and interview. Would love to see a return just to talk about their job, even outside of this context, perhaps for captain speaking." And I would love to get you on our podcast, Shem, and discuss these kind of things. So if you guys are watching this on Captain Speaking, then you know where you are. But if you're watching this on Mentor Pilot or Mentor Now, we do a weekly podcast now, which are out on all platforms. It's called Captain Speaking, and you can find it on YouTube or wherever you find them. So go check that out if you're interested in these kind of collaborations, because this is kind of what we want to do deep dives into these type of subjects, because we feel that it's important. And I think that's as good as any way of ending this. Again, our condolences and thoughts to the families of the victims of this horrific crash. Of course, we will continue to provide updates on all of my channels whenever we get some valid information. But I want to reiterate that we will be forwarding actual information that comes from official sources, and those are really the only ones that you can listen to in situations like this. There will be a lot of people thinking out there and saying what they think happened, but the official sources are really the only thing that you can rely on. Any closing thoughts, Dan, Shem?
I think that that really covers it. We really just need to see what the official reports say, and and then go from there. We may find that there's other things that we can add to those after the fact, and that can be something that we always will be taking a look at in terms of investigations. And I guess you could call it almost a peer review that we tend to do with each other's investigations and see if we can find anything else. And that would be, of course, once we have all the information in. Once the interim report is out, we'll have a lot better idea of what happened here, though. And so that will be the next point, I think, that we'll be able to get something.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Shem, for joining us on the live stream. Ben, thank you for taking the time as well. And like I said, we will be back whenever we know anything else. So everyone out there, have a nice day, and we'll see you next time.